language models are not deterministic. So you can ask the same question twice and you can get two different answers. If you're developing applications for your enterprise, then you want more repeatability. You want to know what to expect. You will work with different building blocks that the application platform offers. These building blocks have been hardened over 15 years of working with many customers and building many apps. All you need to do is to write your application in a specific format. Our coding agents and our LLMs will help you do that very easily. And then we guarantee that you can deploy as many instances of that application as you want. Basically everything that the C3 AI platform can do, now our agent can do. So I'm very excited to show you more.
Hi everyone, welcome to Enterprise AI Spotlight. I'm Pauline Brunet, your host. I'm joined today by Amir Delgoshaie. We'll be talking about coding agents for the enterprise. Amir, welcome. Thanks for joining me. Why don't you start? Tell me a little bit about yourself. What do you do at C3? What cool things are you working on?
I work on developer productivity at C3. So we build our domain-specific LLM. We build MCP tools that are used by all of the different agents that we use for developer productivity. Then we build coding agents, customer support agents, developer agents, and then finally we have some interfaces where all of our developers can go and use these tools and agents. For example, we have something like ChatGPT, but for C3 developers, where you can go and ask any questions that you have. Or we have MCP tools where if you're coding in your favorite IDE like Cursor or VS Code, you can connect to our MCP server and wipe code C3 application instead of like normal applications.
Let's start from the top. What is developer productivity?
That is a great question. I mean, it's very broad, right? But I think more specifically right now, because of the Gen AI revolution and all the coding capabilities that these LLMs and agents have, there's an expectation that coders, developers should be able to write higher quality code and write it faster, right? So they're kind of like broadly, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, the eternal high productivity, let's do more with, fewer resources. Love it. Tell me a little bit about MCP, right? I keep hearing about it. What is MCP? Why is it helpful? And then we could talk about a little bit about, C3 and what we implemented and what's important and relevant.
Sure. So MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. It is basically a way to get relevant context to the models, right? So these frontier models are super strong, right? They know a lot already, but they don't know the specifics of what you are doing, right? The types of application that you are writing or the type of data that you're working for, right? So MCP is the easiest way to get your context to the models, right? In terms of what we're talking about today for like writing code, you can imagine that you have models that are pretty strong in general coding, right? But if you have a specific application development framework, right, these models might not know about the specifics of your framework, right? And MCP lets us get that specific context to the model. So as an example, right, you might have data models as a part of your application, or ontology. There's a data model, ontology, same thing. Then you have a specific syntax for writing that data model, right? Frontier models don't know the syntax for writing a C3 AI data model, right? What our MCP server does is you can just ask it a question of like, how do I define a new type or add something to my data model or make some changes to my data model. And then through MCP, we give the answer to that question or the context that your frontier model needs to make all the changes that you want.
Okay, so we're talking about developer productivity. They're developing on the C3 Agentic AI Platform. Tell me a little bit about the benefits of this platform. What's differentiated?
I mean, the way I think about the C3 AI platform is that it's a platform for building AI applications, right? AI applications are still applications, right? But they're very AI heavy. So some examples of that are you have a lot of modeling in the application, right? So maybe you have traditional ML models, maybe you have like feature sets, you have predictive models or forecasting models that you need to train, you need to deploy for the application to serve, let's say, predictions for a specific thing that you have in your application, right? So as a very common example is like you might have industrial assets, which is actually an example that I would love to go a little bit deeper today. You have industrial assets and you want to know if they will have any like technical problems in the future, right? So you want to do predictive maintenance for them. To build that application, you need all of these ML components in the app, right? But then obviously for it to be an enterprise ready app, right, you need access control, right? So you need to make sure that only the right people have access to certain data in the application. Only the people with the right access can make specific changes to the application, right? So all of that configuration should be very easy. And ideally you don't want to like spend your time building those like platform capabilities every time you want to build a new app, right?
So reusability.
So reusability of these features. What's another good example?
Scalability, I'm sure, right?
Well, yeah. So once you write the application, right, you want to deploy the app, right? What the C3 AI Agentic Platform does is it makes it super easy for you to deploy it. All you need to do is to write your application in a specific format, which our coding agents and LLMs will help you do that very easily, right? And then once it's in that format, we guarantee that you can deploy as many instances of that application as you want, right? So maybe you want, I don't know, an instance of your app for testing, for staging. Maybe you want one for production in every location where you have like a big workforce managing some of your assets, right? It helps you scale very easily. That's kind of like one of the benefits. The other benefit is everything is kind of hardened and tested, right? So you will work with different building blocks that the application platform offers, right? These building blocks have been hardened over 15 years of working with many, many customers and building many, many apps, right? So you kind of get all of those benefits when you're building your next app.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And you're talking to me about hardening, which sort of brings up the topic of vibe coding for me. What is vibe coding? And then what are some of the downfalls in an enterprise setting?
So vibe coding is basically, so coding is coding, right? You write the code for what you want to do, and then you debug it and you deploy that code, or you run that code somewhere, right? Vibe coding now is, instead of you writing code in the syntax of the language that you care about, so I don't know, it might be TypeScript for your UI or Python for your backend, whatever it is, right? You describe what you want, and then there is a coding agent or LLM that writes that code for you, right? So that's vibe coding. It's great. It's very powerful, right? It's also getting better. If you think about like, I don't know, even 2 years ago when right after ChatGPT, or when the first versions of the models like GPT-3.5, GPT-4, when they were out, people could kind of see that, okay, maybe we can ask these models to code like a little function for us. And then there was like, oh, maybe it can build a whole feature. And now it's like all the way to like, maybe they can build the full application for me, right? So they're getting more and more powerful. But then there are some downsides, right? One of them is you're getting like hundreds of files and like thousands of lines of code every time you give an LLM a high-level prompt for building you an application, right? So now, are you sure that that is optimized, right? Does it run fast? Are you sure that that's secure? Are you sure that it's easy to maintain? Are you sure that it's easy to deploy, right? All of these guarantees are pretty hard if you're relying on the LLM to write the full thing for you, right? And I guess like one thing I would say is language models are not deterministic, right? So you can ask the same question twice and you can get two different answers, right? So now if your question is like, make me an app for, I don't know, managing my wind turbines, right? And you ask that twice, you might get two very different applications, right? But now if you're developing applications for your enterprise, then you want more repeatability, right? You want to know what to expect and like kind of have some qualities in mind in the application that you want, and like get a guarantee that you can get that every time.
Makes a lot of sense. So you've got data scientists, developers, front end, back end, probably business folks as well, SMEs, product owners, all working in this platform. So tell me a little bit about productivity, right? What tools are available, and how do they help, develop faster, but also sort of address some of the concerns you just mentioned?
So first of all, we have building blocks for every part of the application. So, right, we have building blocks for creating a very robust ontology or data model, right? So you don't have to recreate that from scratch, right? You can use those platform capabilities, right? Then we have building blocks for all your data operations and all your access control and permissions, right? We have building blocks for all the machine learning features of the application. We have building blocks for building your UI and connecting it to the rest of the application. And then we also have kind of make it easy for you to deploy all of this, right? So once you have an app, we make it easy to deploy. Maybe I should mention there's a lot more in the platform, right? So you can build your own agents and add them to your application. You can add any complex like front end or back end logic that you want, right? If you have a specific workflow, you can define it. You can say like, I have a workflow that has a user experience that looks like this, and then the back end should have like a few different checks, and I want like, I don't know, different personas involved here. I want these hands off in my application, right? It could be a very complex enterprise workflow, and we simplify coding that up for you, right? So that's kind of the application description. Now, as you can imagine, there's a lot in here, right? So there's specific syntax for writing any of these specific pieces, right? So what we have done is we have built language models that are very fluent in this language, right? So they know about every specific piece of a C3 application, and they can just help write it for you, right? So that's kind of the productivity where it comes in. Our LLMs are pretty good and pretty strong, right? But they are not frontier level LLMs. And what we hear from our customers is that they love their frontier LLMs, right? They want to continue working with like, I don't know, Claude Sonnet 4.5 or GPT-5, because for a lot of tasks, they're like super intelligent and very useful, right? So what we've done is we have built our LLM, right? And now through MCP, we have like defined the handoff between our domain-specific model and the frontier models, right? So the frontier model, whenever you ask it to write an application for you, right, it will do all the things that it knows how to do very well. But whenever it gets to a boundary of like, oh, okay, this is a very specific task of like defining a data model in C3 or making changes to a data model or implementing, let's say, a backend API for a C3 application, it will do that handoff to our domain-specific models, right? And through MCP, we make that very easy and seamless for our users.
Tell me about how C3 developers, data scientists, etc., are using these coding agents to work on the C3 Agentic AI platform.
Yeah, so developers have their own favorite IDEs, right? Some of the most popular ones are Cursor, VS Code, which has GitHub Copilot in it, right? So we want developers to use the IDE development environment that they're most comfortable with and they like more than anything else, right? So typical workflow is a developer would still be working in Cursor or VS Code, right? Now, for developing a C3 application, you connect to a C3 development environment. Like, just think of it as your own laptop in the cloud, right? So you're not limited by the machine that you're working on, right? You're like remotely developing on that machine. And then that development environment has all the tools to validate if what you're working on is a valid C3 package and like quickly shows you what you've built so far. It's like an easy deployment. You see the UI as you make changes, see the changes get reflected in your development environment, right? So you're in an IDE, you're connected to a C3 development environment, right? the way our users will interact with coding agents is you will use your favorite coding agent. So let's say it's Cursor, for example, or GitHub Copilot, right? But then you will configure C3 AI MCP server, right, for that handoff between your favorite coding agent and specific coding for the C3 domain. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Sounds like it's flexible, sort of helps me in whatever task I'm trying to do, configure these applications, build new ones.
Exactly. So and the flexibility is very important, right? So we talk to a lot of customers. They all have made different investments and they have their own favorite like developer tools, right? I don't know, Claude Code is very popular now. It's super powerful, right? So if you want to develop with Claude Code, we let you do that. If you want to develop with Cursor, you're able to do that and build C3 applications very quickly. Same for VS Code and GitHub Copilot, right? The beauty of the MCP protocol is that you can bring your own agent, right? And we will give your agent all the tools that it needs to be very successful and efficient at writing C3 code.
Like a BYOA, bring your own agent.
Yeah, BYOA is
we should think about trademarking that. Yeah. I'll get right on that.
And by the way, maybe one thing. So we do have our own coding agents too, right? Which is something we can talk about in the future, right? It's like it's something that we are working on, and we are working on our own agents and our own interfaces to a C3 coding agent that's like super specialized for the tasks that we care about, right? But for today's conversation, right, we are talking about developers, and like it's really important to emphasize this like flexibility that we give you to use your own coding agents.
Makes a lot of sense. Amir, we've worked together for a number of years. Tell me a cool customer, application and how coding agents are helping those developers and those data scientists bring those to life.
That is a great question. So I would say in general, we have two types of questions, right? C3 has a lot of pre-built applications, right? C3 AI reliability, C3 AI inventory optimization, production scheduling optimization, right? So those are full-fledged AI applications with a ton of features, right? But then every time you deploy these applications for a new customer, there is specific configuration that you need to do for that specific use case, right? The assets change, the time series,
data is different.
The data is different, right? But the core of the application is still the same, right? So the way our engineers and data scientists use our coding agents is that they use our MCP server and these tools to configure the application very quickly, right? So a lot of the configuration that is manual is now automated, right? There's also a lot of use cases which are greenfield, right? So we don't have a pre-built data model or a pre-built application for it. And we want to kind of go from 0 to 1 as quickly as we can, right? Their data scientists and our engineers are just using these coding agents to describe the use case and get an initial version of the application that has most of the features that they want and like kind of looks exactly like what the customer wants, and then start iterating from there. So these are kind of the two most common use cases.
Yeah, I worked with a number of manufacturers, CPG. For some reason, no one calculates OTIF the same. So every time we have to change that KPI, so how it's calculated, what it looks like. So that makes sense. I'm sold. Can you show me some cool stuff?
Yeah, definitely.
Let's do it.
Okay, I'm very excited to show you actually what we talked about in practice. For the purpose of illustration, let's assume that we have a wind turbine plant, right? So you have a number of wind turbines as your assets. Maybe you're the plant manager, right? You have time series data for these wind turbines. You have event data for them, and you have their locations and like all the associated data, right? Now you want to build a simple application to just track your assets, right? Visualize them in a simple grid, and then iterate and add more features to the application. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I've always wanted a wind turbine plant, so I'm looking forward to it. Let's do it.
Okay, so that sounds great. Now, the first thing I'll do, I have a little prompt prepared, right? I'll paste the prompt describing exactly what I just told you in Cursor. So for this demo, we use Cursor as our IDE.
your idea of choice, but you could use others.
I
Awesome.
can use others too. Imagine that you are in your favorite IDE. For this demo, it's Cursor. You have a prompt for the use case that we just described. You have put your prompt in the Cursor coding agent, right? And now there's two more steps just to make sure we are connected properly to the C3 environment, right? One is that we need to connect to our C3 development environment, which is what you're looking at here, right? And then the second setup step that we need to do is to connect to the C3 MCP server, right? So the MCP server is, as I mentioned, gives your coding agents all the tools and prompts that it needs to hand off specific tasks to our domain-specific outlet, right?
Yeah.
And you will go over the specific tool calls and everything as we go through the demo. Now, as you can see, the agent is picking up our prompt and coming up with a plan of like what it wants to do, right? And it's like it's going off on its own, so I'm hands off. The first step, what it's doing here, as you can see, is it's creating a package using a C3 AI application template, right? What that allows us to do is to just basically copy over a lot of the boilerplate code that you need without relying on an LLM to write all of that code. First of all, it's expensive, right? There's a lot of token that you don't need to write. And also, it's error prone. So by copying it over, it's like much more repeatable. Then what we're looking at is it made a plan, and now it's going through creating the different types or the different parts of our data model by making MCP tool calls, right? So the first example that we saw was creating a manufacturer object, so like something that represents the manufacturer of a wind turbine, and immediately you can see that it created an implementation file for that manufacturer, right? So
If I don't like the plan, can I change it? Can I
Yes.
adjust?
Yeah, you can always hit stop and type in the changes that you want, right? So like you're in control, but you can also let it run and see what you get, and then maybe edit it later if you didn't like that.
Great.
Okay, so as you can see here, it already wrote a lot of code for us. We saw the manufacturer, for example. This another example is the wind turbine itself, right? We have a wind turbine, and you can see that it has a specific syntax, right? This is the syntax of a C3 type file, and our coding agent was able to write this code even without knowing about the syntax, right? Because it has access to all of these tools.
I also love that it knew that most turbines would have a manufacturer and sort of suggested that as an additional type, but it also understands the relationship between entities. Is that correct? So it understands that a turbine probably has a manufacturer, right? And so that's relevant.
Exactly. The first step was actually designing this data model. So it proposes the initial data model. Obviously, you can change it if you like to.
Great. Okay, what's next?
Okay, so if now that it's almost done, right, you see that it wrote a lot of files in our directory, and there's this little green checkbox next to them, right? That green box means that the files were actually synced successfully to our development environment. Now, if I switch over to our development environment, we can see that we have an application with the same name that I see in my Cursor working directory, Wind Turbine Management. And if I click on it, I can see the UI for the application actually appeared, right? So it went through all the steps of making the data model, making the initial version of the UI, adding some seed data, sample data to the application so I can actually see what it's done. And we have our first version of the app.
Awesome. So there's a couple things. My team's super visual. I want to see a couple of pie charts, some bar charts. More specifically, I want to look at power that's been generated by turbine or by manufacturer or by geographical location. How do I do that?
That's a great question. Obviously, you want to iterate on the UI of your application, right? So in the rest of the demo, right, I will prompt our agent to do these tasks. As an example, I just typed in another prompt for adding a pie chart for power per manufacturer and a bar chart for power per location, right?
Awesome.
That's all the description that I give to my agent. And then the first thing it will do, it will actually go through the package that is written so far, read the relevant context, right? And then figure out the UI changes that it needs to make for those charts to reappear. And very quickly, if I swipe over to the actual application, you can see those pie charts and bar charts appear. So you have like done your first iteration on the UI.
Okay, so it sounds like you probably generated some synthetic data to sort of mock this application in this UI, but I have real data that's coming in from sensors on these turbines, and I've got some data sets in Snowflake or across, manufacturers and some of these assets. Is that easy to ingest? How do you do that? Can you both virtualize and ingest, and show me how to do that quickly?
Now we get back to our conversation about the building blocks, right? If I swipe over again to AI Studio, which I think I mentioned this, AI Studio is really the entry point to the C3 AI platform, right? You can see in my application, we have a tab called data on the left side. And one of the sub items of this data tab is data fusion, right? If I click into data fusion, I can see the visual representation of my application data model, right? So we can again see all of the types that we just created. We can even click on some of them and see the synthetic or the sample data for these types, right? So you mentioned you wanted to ingest data from one of your real data sources. Now, if I go to AI Studio again, you can see the data sources tab, right? If I click on it and then click on add a new data source, you see I have a large number of data sources to select from, right? And you mentioned your data is in Snowflake, so let's configure a Snowflake data source instance for this demo, right? If I click on it, basically I'm 2 steps away for full integration with your Snowflake instance. All I need from you now is your authentication for Snowflake.
So this looks like I'm using sort of no-code tooling to do this, not necessarily the coding agent, but you also have sort of no-code, low-code tooling on the platform.
Yeah, that is correct. So you write the code for the application, right? But you still have access to all the features of C3 AI Studio, right? So if you want to configure a part of it using the UI, you're also able to do that.
I want to add some back-end logic. So for example, I want to know what are the events and have a couple of analytics running on those. How do I do that?
So in general, we can add any complex back-end logic to our application, right? All we need to do again is to go prompt our agent. As an example, I'm adding a new Python method to our wind turbine type to calculate and add statistics like average, min, max of average of events per turbine location. So again, I will type that prompt to my coding agent, right? And as you can see, it will go read the current implementation of the wind turbine type, read the implementation of the backend that we have. The first thing it will do, it will edit the type to add a new method, right? So we call a tool called run edit C3 type. And then if I click on the file, we see that, okay, there's a new method added, but this time the method is in Python, exactly what we wanted. And we also have an implementation file for this wind turbine type. And then when we go to that implementation tab, we see the exact implementation of the statistics that we described now implemented in Python.
Great.
So now we should actually one more important thing that I want to mention is that because I'm connected to my C3 development environment, right, I'm able to validate these code changes, right? You can see a tool call here that says read package issues. All this means is that we added new code to our package. We're validating that this is valid C3 code, right?
Great.
So I have one more layer of confidence that like, okay, this package is actually close to being production ready.
Great.
Okay, so let's and in the end you see a summary of all the changes that was made. Now if I go back to AI Studio, the first thing I'll see is that method get event statistics by location is actually added to our visual representation, right? And now it's available in my application to use.
Okay, this is great. I'd love access. Can you grant me access to the application?
That sounds good. If I go back to the studio view, right, you see one of the other side panel items that we have is administrative tool. So here, one of the things that we can do is user management. You can see that I already have some users in the application, so it's me and some other test users, and I can add you or any of my other colleagues, right? So for this example, let's say we will add you as a data scientist, right? So you get access to the analytic tools available in the application.
Okay, that's great. Although I'm not a data scientist, I'm actually a plant manager, and I would like to have access where I can only add or remove turbines. So is that possible to do? Can you create something for me?
Sure, we can do that. A custom role is just code in the application. What I can do is I describe the role that you want. So plant manager, who is the only person who's allowed to add or remove wind turbines. So in general, I describe it as like perform CROT operations on our wind turbines, right? I instruct our coding agents to do that through the C3 MCP server. It has the instruction it needs to write that piece of code for defining this custom role. And we see the role here, and it looks good. It says a plant manager has permission to create or remove wind turbines. And now if I go back to my user management, I see that that custom role also appears there, and I can assign it to you. So you're a data scientist and a plant manager in this application.
Thank you. I'm a data scientist in the role you attributed me. I'd love to do some data exploration, maybe some light AI ML modeling, some predictive analytics. Can I do that in a Jupyter Notebook?
Let me show you. If I go back to the AI Studio view and go to the main page of our application, you see this Jupyter icon on the top right corner, right? If I open it, basically you get access to our hosted Jupyter service. It's a Jupyter service that has all the connections that you need to this application, right? So on the top you see like, okay, you see you're connected and you have all the features that you want, plus a lot of other useful features that comes out of the box with the C3 AI Jupyter service. Let's say for example, you want to perform EDA, right? So now, as a data scientist, you have access to the same exact data model and the same data that we saw, right? You can query that data, so you can do wind turbine.eval, and you get the data in your Jupyter Notebook, right? Right now, you can, for example, convert it to a pandas data frame and go to whatever favorite library you have for your data exploration. You can visualize it. You can make plots using matplotlib. Importantly, you also get access to all the same methods that we saw on our data model. So this get event statistic method that we just created together, you will get access to that. So now application engineers can kind of iterate on the application and add more backend logic, and then all of that logic would be immediately available to all of the data scientists.
That's great. I'm looking forward to going through that Jupyter Notebook. You've written a lot of code, or the agent has. I'm a little stressed out about testing. Can agents help me, write tests in order for me to feel confident this is production grade and ready?
Tests are code that, again, you add to your application package, right? It's the same pattern. What we need to do is to get the correct instructions to our agent to write tests that work with C3 AI application, which is exactly what I'm doing through the MCP prompts here, right? I describe as an example that I want tests for all the methods on my wind turbine type, and we just added a custom method, and there were some existing ones for pulling data, right? So what the agent will do, it will analyze the package, read all the code that's written so far, and add a test file to my application package. Now, the part that is really cool is that because I'm connected to my C3 development environment, right, the agent can actually run the test on my application, right? So here we can see that it wrote 13 tests and it ran them. One of them is failing. It gets feedback from the application, so it knows exactly what failed, so it can iterate, right? And then the next iteration, we see that actually all of the tests are passing. So this is one of my favorite parts, right? Because writing tests is always hard, and making them pass is an art. So I really appreciate the help I get from agents for this part.
I can imagine. This is awesome. There's lots more that I would love to explore with you. I know that I can do some very intense, artificial intelligence, machine learning, predictive modeling in order to do things like optimization, prediction, forecasting, which I think we'll hit in our next time because we were running out of time today. But just closing words, what's the coolest part? What are you most excited about what we're working on?
We started from a blank application package. We added the data model, we added synthetic data, we defined backend APIs, we added a simple UI, we iterated on a UI. What else did we do? We
wrote some tests, we changed the UI based on my feedback, we added users.
Right? We saw the full data model ontology, we saw everything reflected immediately as we
ingested my data.
We ingested your data from Snowflake, right? So the part that's really exciting to me is that I'm not an expert in all of these steps, right? But I had a super powerful agent that let me do all of this in less than 20 minutes, right? So I think it's a super powerful tool. It's allowing our teams and our customers to iterate on a lot of their ideas that they have super quickly and get very quick time to value, right? To me, that's the most exciting part. And also, basically everything that the C3 AI platform can do, now our agent can do. So I'm very excited to show you more next time we talk.
That's great. And in a production grade way, right? So you don't have to worry about that.
That is true, right? Because all the code that we wrote was already code that fit in with one of the kind of battle-hardened building blocks that we have in the C3 platform, right? So you can be confident that these components have been tested a lot, and also we wrote tests for this specific application, right? And you can imagine this will allow you to iterate so much faster.
Love it. Time to value, agility, scalability, develop productivity. Thanks for your time, Amir, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Pauline.
Thanks everyone for joining us on Enterprise AI Spotlight, and we'll see you soon.